Hello and welcome to the Joe Ligato Show. I'm your host, Dr. Joe Ligato, and today we're going to be reviewing an interview that Arnaud Bertrand has posted on Twitter, and it is an interview of Dominique de Villepin on what is going on in Gaza and how to look at Gaza from a historical context. And so Dominique de Villepin is the former prime minister of France, and this is back when France had a little bit more autonomy, a little bit more sovereignty than it has today. It's very clear that France is a puppet of the American Western Empire. And this Dominique famously led France's opposition to the Iraq War, and who, in Arnaud's opinion, is the best diplomat the West has produced in decades. And to be quite frank, I don't think the Western world has diplomats at this point. Once they were at the end of history with the collapse of the Soviet Union, it seems very clear that they just gave up on diplomacy and said that they're going to get their way no matter what. And so at this point, you're seeing from the current crisis in Palestine that they really just don't have a diplomatic bone in their body anymore. So let's see what else they have to say. So Arnaud translated all of this. So he says that Dominique said Hamas has set a trap for us, and this trap is one of maximum horror, of maximum cruelty. And so there's a risk of escalation in militarism, of more military interventions, as if we could, with armies, solve a problem as serious as the Palestinian question. There's also a second major trap, which is that of Occidentalism. We find ourselves trapped with Israel in this Western bloc, which today is being challenged by most of the international community. Okay, so that's a very honest statement that pretty much everyone outside the Western world is against the West right now. And the presenter who is interviewing Dominique here asks, what is Occidentalism? And I think that's actually a very good question because, well, let's just see what Dominique has to say on the topic. Occidentalism is the idea that the West, which for 5 centuries managed the world's affairs, will be able to quietly continue to do so. Okay, so just that's a pro-Western type of idea. It used to be that there was the Occidental world and then the Oriental world. And so they're just saying the West when they say Occidentalism. And when they say 5 centuries, I don't know if it was a full 5 centuries really, but I mean, even if it was, you have to remember that before those 5 centuries, there were places like China, places like India that were really powerful. And so it's only a few centuries that the Western world has been as powerful as it was within the past few years. Nowadays, I don't think the Western world is particularly powerful anymore, but I mean, you could still at least have the living memory of the Western world being powerful. And that's not historically the case outside of this 500-year, very short time span. And we can clearly see even in the debates of the French political class that there is the idea that faced with what is currently happening in the Middle East, we must continue to fight even more towards what might resemble a religious or a civilizational war. Okay, so we're seeing that not only the multipolar bloc, but also the Western bloc is starting to consider this a civilizational war. And I've been saying this for a decade now, that the West is trying to wipe out all the other civilizations of the world. This is called global homogeneity. And the West, for the longest time, was winning. But now it seems like the multipolar world, due to its large population size, access to a ton of resources, manufacturing base, they are finally starting to rally and unify to fight back against this. And then Dominique goes on to say to isolate ourselves even more on the international stage. This is not the way, especially since there's a third trap, which is that of moralism. And here we have, in a way, the proof through what is happening in Ukraine and what is happening in the Middle East of this double standard that is denounced everywhere in the world, including in recent weeks when I traveled to Africa, the Middle East, or Latin America. Yes, I've been pointing this out so often. I mean, you have a double standard when you're considering things like Kosovo versus Crimea, but then if you want like really contemporary examples, you could just compare how Ukraine and how Israel are being treated to see this double standard in action. You really can't agree with both Ukraine and Israel at the same time unless your entire mindset is one of supporting the imperialistic West. The criticism is always the same. Look at how the civilian populations are treated in Gaza. You denounce what happened in Ukraine, and you are very timid in the face of the tragedy unfolding in Gaza. Completely agree. I've talked about this in other videos, which is that more civilians have died in Gaza as supposedly collateral damage than the entire Russian war, as far as I understand it. And so it's really strange that they have so many humanitarian concerns for what's happening in Ukraine, where Russia is acting very humanely, but they have zero concerns about what's happening in Israel. And so that double standard should upset you. Consider international law. The second criticism that is made by the global south: we sanction Russia when it aggresses Ukraine. We sanction Russia when it doesn't respect the resolution of the United Nations. And it's been 70 years that the resolution of the United Nations have been voted in vain, and that Israel doesn't respect them. Okay, so the interviewer then goes on to say, do you believe that the Westerners are currently guilty of hubris? Westerners must open their eyes to the extent of the historical drama unfolding before us to find the right answers. Okay, that wasn't a particularly good question I think the interviewer was hoping for. Let's see. What is the historical drama? I mean, we're talking about the tragedy of October 7th, first and foremost. See, that's so weird of a response. Like, October 7th was very minimal of a tragedy compared to the rest of what happened to Gaza. Like, if you just compare, at least half of the casualties on October 7th were of soldiers, were of people of a military background. The people that were caught in the crossfire seem to have been attacked by Israel instead of Hamas. I mean, there was evidence of tank shelling. It was obviously not Hamas. And so there were so many instances where, out of everything that happened since this conflict started, or at least since this round of the conflict started on October 7th, it seems like what happened on October 7th when Hamas was the one doing the engaging, that was far more humane than what has happened since October 7th. So I just hate when the presenters talk about things like this. We found out so many things, like the beheaded baby story was not true out of Israel. They had some fake photos that were obviously AI generated. You have the stories of the people who were supposedly attacked, the rave goers, that it turns out that they were completely fine. They weren't murdered. There was a recent story about a baby in an oven, and it turns out that they just recycled that story from when the Israelis put a Palestinian baby in an oven decades ago. Like, it's so inhumane what is going on right now. And yeah, anyways, I'm just gonna move on. Okay, but who is killing the whom? Okay, so that's what the interviewer says. I just skipped a little bit. You're in a game of cause and effects, faced with the tragedy of history. One cannot take this chain of causality analytical grid simply because if you do, you can't escape from it. Once we understand that there is a trap, once we realize that behind this trap there has also been a change in the Middle East regarding the Palestinian issue. Yeah, and I completely agree. I think she's going to go on to talk about how both Sunnis and Shias are really coalescing, really uniting right now. The situation today is profoundly different from what it was in the past. I don't think the West understands this yet, right? I don't think the West understands that when Israel has gone into conflicts before, it's had enough of the world behind it that it's allowed to be as inhumane as it wants. But now there are so many people that are on the side of Palestine that it just cannot. It's a different situation now. And people are starting to realize that their democracies aren't actual democracies, because whenever they say something about the Palestinian issue, they're just not listened to by their politicians, okay? Whereas in places like China, the people believe in the Palestinian cause, and then the government also supports the Palestinian cause. And it's like, in the West, the people believe in the Palestinian cause, and then the government, the elites, the oligarchs, they don't believe in the Palestinian cause, they support Israel. And so it's like, there's this disconnect there where at its basis, democracy is about representing the people and the people's will, and the West just does not do that. It, by definition, does not do that. Okay, so they go on to say the Palestinian cause was a political and secular cause. Today we are faced with an Islamist cause led by Hamas. Obviously, this kind of cause is absolute and allows no form of negotiation. On the Israeli side, there's also been development. Zionism was secular and political, championed by Theodor Herzl in the late 19th century. It has largely become messianic, biblical today. Okay, so that is because of demographics, where a lot of the population of Israel is becoming more and more far right because of the far right people getting out of military duty and instead just reproducing a lot. And so they're making up a larger and larger portion of the population and a larger and larger voting bloc. And so the country just as a whole is becoming more religious because of fertility rates amongst the religious versus the non-religious. And when they talk about it becoming messianic and biblical, they're really talking about the land of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which they're thinking that they need to build the third temple on in order to bring about the end of times. And so we are really at an end times prophecy. So really scary stuff going on right now. This means that they too do not want to compromise in everything that the far right Israeli government does, continuing to encourage colonization, obviously makes things worse, including since October 7th. So in this context, understand that we are already in this region facing a problem that seems profoundly insoluble. Added to this is the hardening of states. Diplomatically, look at the statements of the King of Jordan. They are not the same as 6 months ago. Look at the statements of Erdogan and Turkey. Yeah, this has been interesting because Erdogan and Jordan are still allowing equipment and soldiers from places like the United States to pass through their countries. They're still allowing things like oil, and they still have ties with Israel. And so it's a really weird situation because their populations are really frothing at the mouth in order to protect Palestine, but their governments really have only tepidly helped Palestine. They're, for the most part, still doing what Israel wants. Okay, so the presenter goes on to say, precisely, these are extremely harsh statements, extremely worrying. Why? Because if the Palestinian cause, the Palestinian issue hasn't been brought to the forefront, it hasn't been put on stage for a while, and if most of the youth today in Europe have often never even heard of it, it remains for the Arab peoples the mother of all battles, all the progress made towards an attempt to stabilize the Middle East, where one could believe. Okay, so the presenter continues to go on, yes, but whose fault is it? I have a hard time following you. Is it Hamas's fault? Okay, so they always try to blame Hamas, but I mean, everything that's come out that seems like Hamas is the bad guy has turned out to be a lie. So I again am not a supporter of Hamas because of the fact that they fought against the Syrian government. I think the Syrian government was and is the most humane option within Syria. But I do think that was a mistake. That was a religious mistake because they are Sunnis and they thought that it was in their best interest to overthrow the Shia government in Syria in order to install a Sunni-led government. I don't think it was in their best interest. I think they were going to install a Israeli puppet like they have in other places of the Middle East, which I'm not going to directly name. But anyways, okay. So this person says that the question of fault will be addressed by historians and philosophers, not diplomats. So whose fault is it, Hamas or Palestine? The presenter goes on, but you can't remain neutral. It's difficult. It's complicated, isn't it? It's so frustrating because the journalists are rabidly pro-Israel. And you have to remember, no, I'm not even going to get into that part. I refuse. I'm not neutral, I'm in action. Dominique says, I'm simply telling you that every day that passes, we can ensure that this horrific cycle stops. That's why I speak of a trap, and that's why it's so important to know what response we are going to give. We stand alone before history today, and we do not treat this new world the way we currently do, knowing that today we're no longer in a position of strength. We are not able to manage on our own as the world's policemen. Okay, so they're talking about the declining Western world. Ooh, okay. So this is an interesting, it's a short exchange, but it's actually very interesting. So the presenter goes on to say, so what do we do? Exactly what should we do? Dominique says, this is where it is essential not to cut off anyone on the international stage. Okay, so that leads for this next question, which is including the Russians. Okay, so they really want Dominique, the interviewer really wants Dominique to say, you can't talk to the Russians. And Dominique replies, everyone. So including the Russians. Everyone, should we ask the Russians for help? Yes, the Russians actually have more influence in this situation than the West right now because the Russians have decent relationships with Israel and they have really good relationships with the rest of the Arabic world, or the rest of the Middle East, I should say, because Israel is not a part of the Arabic world. Okay, so Dominique goes on to say, I'm not saying we should ask the Russians for help. I'm saying if the Russians can contribute by calming some factions in the region, then it will be a step in the right direction. The presenter goes on to say, how can we proportionally respond to barbarism? It's no longer army against army. Yeah, this presenter is very clearly biased here, and they're biased in the wrong direction. This is a bias that is unfortunately going to lead to the West collapsing, but that is the current stakes for right now. The Western civilization just, it cannot function in the way it's currently functioning, and it's not willing to change at all. Okay. So the presenter essentially says, the interviewer essentially says that you can't respond proportionally to barbarism. You have to respond with full force. I mean, that's how I interpreted it. So Dominique goes on to say, but listen, Apolline de Maharbi, or whatever you pronounce it, the civilian populations that are dying in Gaza, don't they exist? So because horror was committed on one side, horror must be committed on the other. And then the interviewer goes on, do we indeed need to equate the two? So for some reason, this interviewer really thinks that the Israeli consequences, the Israeli casualties are worse than what's happening in Palestine. And then Dominique goes on and does exactly what I think she should do in this situation. I don't even know if Dominique's a guy or girl, but I'm going to assume Dominique is a female name. But Dominique goes on to say, no, it's you who are doing that. I'm not saying I equate the fault. I try to take into account what a large part of humanity. Actually, I'm going to look it up because I'm really curious now. Dominique. Wait, let's see. What was this? Devolved. See, the French people have such funny names that I don't even know if that's a male or female name at that point. That is a male name. For some reason, I had a suspicion that it was a male name, even though I typically consider Dominique to be a female name. But yeah, so this is a male. Okay, so where were we? Okay, so Dominique goes on to say, you don't need to equate the two. I'm not saying I equate the faults. I try to take into account what a large part of humanity thinks. And humanity is very clearly on the side of the Palestinians right now. There is certainly a realistic objective to pursue, which is to eradicate the Hamas leaders who committed this horror and not to confuse the Palestinians with Hamas. That's a realistic goal. Second thing is a targeted response. Let's define realistic political objectives. And third thing is a combined response, because there's no effective use of force without a political strategy. We're not in 1973 or 1967. There are things no army in the world knows how to do, which is to win an asymmetrical battle against terrorists. The war on terror has never been won anywhere, and it instead triggers extremely dramatic misdeeds, cycles, and escalations. If America lost in Afghanistan, if America lost in Iraq, if we lost in the Sahel, which is like the upper parts of Africa, northern Africa types of area, and there's like a deserty area in the upper parts of Africa as well. It's because it's a battle that can't be won. Simply, it's not like you have a hammer that strikes a nail and the problem is solved. So we need to mobilize the international community, get out of this Western entrapment in which we are. Okay. All right, so I'm gonna skip some of this. Where are we? All right. Oh, no, we're almost at the end. I'm not going to skip this. Okay. Okay, so Emmanuel Macron talks about an international coalition, and Dominique goes back to say yes, and what was the response? And the interviewer says none. So they don't have this international coalition. And that's the thing. The West is completely isolated at this point. If you're living in the West, you don't understand that. So Dominique goes on to say, exactly, we need a political perspective, and this is challenging because the two-state solution has been removed from the Israeli political and diplomatic program. Israel needs to understand that for a country with a territory of 20,000 square kilometers, a population of 9 million inhabitants, facing 1.5 billion people, people have never forgotten that the Palestinian cause and the injustice done to the Palestinians was a significant source of mobilization. We must consider this situation. And I believe it is essential to help Israel to guide, some say impose, but I think it's better to convince to move in this direction. The challenge is that there is no interlocutor. Today, neither on the Israeli side nor the Palestinian side, we need to bring out interlocutors, which is interesting because it sounds like the Chinese and Russians are going to be those interlocutors. An interlocutor, I guess a way of talking about that, I don't know a specific definition, but I would say they're kind of like a mediator type of person. The interviewer says it's not for us to choose who will be the leaders of Palestine. The Israeli policy over recent years, Dominique replies, did not necessarily want to cultivate a Palestinian leadership. Many are in prison, and Israel's interest, because I repeat, is not in their program or in Israel's interest at the time, or so they thought, was instead to divide the Palestinians and ensure that the Palestinian question fades. Okay, so I'm going to pause there for a second. They really did. Israel really did support Hamas because they thought that helping the Islamists would stop the secularists from winning, and people were more sympathetic in the West to the secularist factions such as Fatah within Palestine. And so Israel really did bring this on themselves. They've been supporting Islamists like Hamas, like ISIS, things like that, like Al-Qaeda. And so I can only be so sympathetic towards them when they are actively making sure that their opposition is as hostile and savage as possible. That's their goal because they want to make themselves look better in comparison. So anyways, let's move on. This Palestinian question will not fade, and so we must address it and find an answer. This is where we need courage. The use of force is a dead end. The moral condemnation of what Hamas did, there's no but in my words regarding the moral condemnation of this horror, must not prevent us from moving forward politically and diplomatically in an enlightened manner. The law of retaliation is a never-ending cycle. So the interviewer goes on the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth thing. Okay, so oh, do I want to get into this? Okay, whenever I start doing live streams, just take note of this. I will talk about how I think the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth thing is a dumb saying. And so I will get into that. If you are really interested, leave it in the comment box below. I really think that's a dumb saying. I don't think it intends what people think it intends, but I can get into that later. Okay, so yes, that's why political response must be defended. Israel has a right of defense, but this right cannot be indiscriminate vengeance. Okay, so international law actually says they do not have a right to self-defense here because they are an occupying force. And there cannot be collective responsibility of the Palestinian people for the actions of a terrorist minority from Hamas. And so, again, it does sound like it's something like 8,000 casualties, 8,000 deaths, I mean, not just casualties, on the Palestinian side, and they only have about a dozen confirmed Hamas kills. And so it sounds like this is pretty indiscriminate killing right now. When you get into this cycle of finding faults, one side's memories clash with the other. Some will juxtapose Israel's memories with the memories of the Nakba, the 1948 catastrophe, which is a disaster that the Palestinians still experience every day. So you can't break these cycles. We must have strength, of course, to understand and denounce what happened. And from this standpoint, there's no doubt about our position, but we must also have the courage, and that's what diplomacy is. Diplomacy is about being able to believe that there is light at the end of the tunnel, and that's the cunning of history. When you're at the bottom, something can happen that gives hope. After the 1973 war, who would have thought that before the end of the decade, Egypt would sign a peace treaty with Israel? And it sounds like Egypt is completely controlled by Israel at this point, given other videos we've talked about where it looks like Israel's just thinking about pushing all the Palestinian population into the Sinai. The debate shouldn't be about rhetoric or word choice. The debate today is about action. We must act. And when you think about action, there are two options. It's either war, or it's about trying to move towards peace. And I'll say again, it's in Israel's interest. It's in Israel's interest. Okay, so interesting translation here by Arnaud Bertrand, and I would recommend following them on Twitter and this person's Twitter handle is at Arnaud Bertrand. If you're watching this, you could just see that. If you're listening, I'm sure you can find him easily enough by just looking up his last name, Bertrand, Bertrand. Okay. And so that's what we have for you today. I thought this interview translation was of enough interest that we really should be going over it and we really should be talking about it. It's very clear that even some of the best Western diplomats, politicians, things like that are starting to recognize that the West is losing this civilizational war between the Western civilization and the other 5 or potentially 6 civilizations of the world. India is, who knows what's happening with the Indian civilization right now. But that's the current situation we're in. So if you found this video to be informative, please leave us a like, a thumbs up. It helps us in the algorithm. Please subscribe to our channel on both YouTube and Rumble. And please leave us a comment in the comment box below. Questions, concerns, critiques, I read all of them. Thank you for watching, and I hope you have a good rest of your day. Bye.